So I wanted to talk about obviously the big news coming out of the right in the last couple of weeks, which has been this sudden proliferation of really insane anti-Semitism, starting from obviously Nick Fuentes, but his podcast with Tucker Carlson, then the Heritage Foundation, and then even in the last week or two, speculation that people like JD Vance are refusing to publicly condemn it, and then now even the controversy this week with Trump. So I would love to get your thoughts. We can go big picture and then drill down on specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, introduce myself, Kimo Gandall. I was the prior chairman of the California College Republicans. Partaked in a lot of debates on UCI college campus. I just graduated Harvard Law School. I'm an attorney now here in Texas. Deal a lot with Republican Party affairs, especially the college Republicans. So love to talk about this. Thank you for having me on, Daniel.
Of course. So, I mean, you can even talk about how this is affecting college campuses, because obviously Nick Fuentes' following, they call themselves the Groypers. You can probably tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah,
They are disproportionately attracting younger, often men, on college campuses. And so right now it seems like, at least, I'm very much armchair outside, sociologist trying to understand it, but it really seems like there's a battle for the young men of the Republican Party now between, the Ben Shapiro and, Charlie Kirk when he was still alive were, a lot more classic conservative versus the populists of, the Tucker Carlson types.
Yeah, so I have to push back against that a bit. A lot of these people, including, by the way, if you watch, I've watched a good chunk of America First, and if you actually watch it and listen to him, he started out as a Ben Shapiro fan. A lot of these people did, and actually, if you actually look at the policy advocacies of these groups, Ben Shapiro would probably agree with them on a lot of things. Obviously, not the Israel issue, which we could tackle later. But let's talk about one they both agree on: gay marriage, right? Obergefell. That case openly basically said anyone who had a traditional view of marriage is discriminatory and they're obsolete and they're just part of an old age of, some leftists said this is literally what happened at UCI, where we were talking about immigration, racists, Nazis, perfect one there. I was a big advocate of immigration reform, including putting up the border wall, right? And the Democrats' only response to that was, well, who else had immigration reforms? Nazis. So you're a Nazi too. And so part of the demystification of Nazism, which is very unscholarly, very unacademic, is basically calling anyone who has any sort of policy towards government intervention a Nazi if you don't like them.
I agree that it probably is not a reasonable move, it was not a reasonable move for Democrats to, or for really anybody to call anybody who's not an actual Nazi a Nazi. But if the left spends years calling the right Nazis, it's not a reasonable thing for the right to actually become Nazis. In other words, if I every single day that I see you say, you're ugly, you're ugly, you're ugly, a reasonable response is not for you to make yourself ugly. It's to, beautify yourself so that, and so for
sure, but to push back on this, like if you listen to, here's an adjacent move, the incel movement's very adjacent to this, right? There's a lot of jokes you watch America First about incels, right? And so, and this is what partially attracts young men so much is the gender war. And we see the gender war statistically, right? This is always a big dialogue on the right. You see this particularly proliferate in countries like Korea. Is that if you say incel, 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 incel every day, people begin to just think, identify with that. Maybe not on the policy perspective. None of those quote unquote incels. Nick Fuentes is not an incel really at the base, right? But they begin to identify by that, and the movement begins to take on that word. Any population.
But wasn't the right? I mean, I guess what confuses me is that when I was in college, I'm going to sound like one of those old men back in my day. The right was against this sort of victim culture that was pretty ubiquitous on campus, 10 or 12 years ago. And so this idea of, victimization. And now what I start to see from, again, exactly what you're describing from this, incel, Nick Fuentes like culture is, oh, we're the victims, poor us, so by what metric is this classical conservative or libertarian or anything like that? It just seems like an entirely new thing. And so, yeah, I mean, the incel movement. But again, I would say the same thing. If people keep calling you, incel, 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 the way to respond to that is not to then say, yes, you're right, I'm going to move into my parents' basement and play video games all day and, insult women. It's to, look. It's to, I don't know, look in the mirror and say, what can you actually do to benefit yourself?
is okay. Again, I'm peeling this back. I'm acting charitably towards these people for a moment. Let's think about the job statistics. And by the way, this is what the left talks about too, because the left is partially right on this issue. Housing prices are unsustainable. You cannot live in California. I graduated Harvard Law School and I'm an attorney, and I have no hopes or aspirations of moving back to California and forming a family. It's completely unaffordable. You can't live a traditional lifestyle there. And so if you're faced with those economic realities, it's going to push you to make certain conclusions about the state of reality. It's not just economic realities, it's social realities. If you look at I think in 2025 is the first time where young men are reported to think about marriage more than young women. And so that inversion of reality where the social expectations and economic realities are colliding, you are going to create a culture which looks at any sort of remedy for conclusion. And the fact is, again, I'm very bullish actually on the free market. I would have to say, Daniel, you've known me 10 years. The one thing I've moved on since undergrad is I am much more bullish on the free market. And the fact is all of these constraining economic realities in California, the inability to build anything, is creating a generation of radicals. And to some extent, rightfully so. They have nothing to lose. And so if we're going to act charitably towards them, the reason extremism is
But
begetting
how is
this.
that true? One second. I'm just
Yeah.
because now I almost when you're talking, I can easily replace you with somebody on the far left and they would probably say the same thing. And I just don't understand that argument. If you're talking about your average undergrad on a California campus, they are in the luckiest 0.1 percentile of people in human history. They are government funded public education. They can study something they're passionate about. Yes, the job market's not ideal now, but if they study something reasonable, they can probably get a job after if they want and they leave their
I
dorm.
disagree with that one, but
There's a budding social life that they can have. They can meet people. There are clubs on campus. I mean, by what metric, right? This is not people walking around with no hope for anything in life. They have and you're sort of describing a situation where I mean, I'm afraid it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. You tell a bunch of 19-year-old men and their algorithm on social media is filled with you have no hope, you have no hope, you have no hope. And well, what do you know? A lot of them start to have no hope, right? But that is not a classical conservative message. The classical conservative
definitely
message
not.
that, again, I grew up in a pretty conservative political community. The message was always, whether or not one agrees with this, and I don't even know if I still agree with this, but you have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get over it and suck it up, right? That's the classical conservative perspective, not everything that you're describing now.
Yeah, and the classical conservative perspective is outdated, is what I'm saying. There was a recent report that just came out. I'm looking at the Forbes article right now on it. Just 30% of 2025 graduates got full-time jobs. They've been systematically lied to by boomers. I remember back in high school, they said, oh, if you go to a nice college, you're guaranteed a job. Guess what? If you're not going to Harvard Law, a lot of lawyers aren't getting jobs either. Yes, everyone at Harvard Law is getting a job. Also, there probably aren't many Groypers at Harvard Law. So there is a matching of economic reality. Now, the difference between me and the far left, I might agree with some of the economic arguments of the left. The problem is they have all the solutions wrong. Their solutions are much worse. The classic, cure is worse than the disease. And a lot of these problems stem from their supposed remedies. So I think AI is going to increase this radicalization to a certain perspective, both socially, because it's going to entice algorithms that just recite your viewpoint. It also creates the perverse incentive to say the edgiest anti-normative things, right? Part of the reason Nick Fuentes makes these jokes is it's a vicious cycle, is it increases clicks, it increases views, people listen to the message, and then you get more traction on Twitter. Like, this is just an objective description of reality. And again, I would defend, we could talk about JD Vance later. I would completely defend the administration's actions on the grounds of pure, just normal international realism. I think they just have a realpolitik view of the world, which is not really something that they've lied about. That's just been their policy the whole time. So yeah, I would disagree that the reality of college graduates is kind of this sparkly thing. It's actually almost worse. I would say if you are amongst that 70% of college grads that don't have jobs, and you are now facing a $50,000 debt with a 15% interest rate, you are far worse off than the plumber that is now making 90,000 a year.
Oh,
Uh,
I completely agree with that. And again, I'm not saying that the prospects haven't been, you know, ideal, right? I obviously get the reality, but the way in which, you started, you were leading is essentially saying, well, you have these 19-year-old men with zero hope for anything in life. No girls will talk to them. They're not going to get any jobs. So they might as well all become neo-Nazis and go down this rabbit
that's
hole,
not
right?
what I'm
Like
saying. That's
that,
not what I'm
that,
saying.
that is a logic that, or the similar in the incel community, right? They have no, prospects for getting married or having sex or anything or getting jobs. So they might as well spend all their days, brutalizing women, verbally and then in internet comments. Like, I just don't understand that mindset at all, right? If I'm one of these students and, I work with a lot of students, and what I, would urge them is, okay, only 30% of, graduates are getting jobs. What are you doing to make sure you're in the 30%? Right?
Sure.
This should be the message that popular figures are
Well,
saying. So I totally understand why someone like Nick Fuentes, who probably feels the exhilaration of being viral on social media, I'm sure he's raking in tons of money. I'm sure Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Dave Smith, right?
well, Candace Owens is different. She's just on the kind of the schizo path. But yeah,
But
continue.
whatever. I am sure these people are much richer than they were a year or two ago
Absolutely.
because of this. And so I understand that the economic incentive for them to do it. I don't understand why perfectly quote unquote normal 18, 19, 20-year old, again, mostly men, are completely giving up on, any sense of values and, self-responsibility and everything. Yes, things are difficult, but the reality is, if you look at most times in human history, there were challenges, and leaders, especially, in the classical conservative tradition, were not saying, yes, you're right, you have no hope, you might as well become as nihilistic as possible and, spew anti-Semitism or spew sexism. They said, yes, things are difficult, so you better make sure that you're stronger, right? Life's
Right.
tough, get a
Well,
helmet type
I'll
thing.
point this out. Most American population, again, this is the problem with being terminally online, which I guess both of us sort of are. Most of the American population is not out there spewing anti-Semitism. You
No,
know,
but I read this past week that Candace Owens' podcast was the most downloaded, I think, 2 weeks ago, and Tucker Carlson, I think, is usually in the top 5 or 6.
yeah, but I know not a single person who would take it seriously that you think Israel or Egypt or whoever the next, conspiracy theory is assassinated Charlie Kirk. Like, come on. This Candace Owens is literally on her podcast, because I do watch it. To be fair, I watch everybody, because I'm not going to call someone schizo unless I actually watch it. When you say like Charlie Kirk came to you in a dream and that's how we're going to discover the assassin, right? I mean, first off, that sounds like a genius defense to defamation, because you just say, well, I had a dream and it came to me. But second off, no one reason like it's entertaining to watch the train wreck, right? And so she's making a lot of money, but that's not political reality. And I think, to be charitable towards you, I think your concern is less about the word for word, like how outrageous it is, and more about if the rhetoric is dangerous to your community. And I would say overall, Groypers are far less violent than the far left. They're not out there burning down cities. And so the response to them needs to be proportional to what's happening. Yes, if they were firebombing government buildings, then of course we should be out there arresting
No,
them.
but it's not just about that. I mean, you're right, not yet. One, I mean, I'm not a prophet,
I
but
don't think they are. I
I
don't think
would,
they're going
no,
to.
I mean, I would guess, we'll follow up on this question in a couple of years, because I would guess there is going to be an increase in Groyper violence against Jews, right? I don't see how you can spend all of your time listening to theories about how the Jews are responsible for all of these sad sociologic and economic conditions that you're in, right? It's the Jews, right? According to the Groypers, right? The Jews have rigged the economy. The Jews have rigged the media. The Jews have spread things like pornography, sort of ruined your dating prospects, right? Like, all these things are the Jews' fault, according to people, that follow Nick Fuentes and such.
Okay, well, wait. Can,
And
can I
and
can
yeah,
I
but
address
one second, just to finish this thought, and then you have people like Tucker Carlson who, okay, Tucker Carlson is not Nick Fuentes, but then, coming out with alternative views of the Holocaust, and maybe Churchill was actually the villain and Hitler was vindicated in a lot of ways. I mean, these things, even if this doesn't directly relate to, more synagogues getting shot up, which again, I'm skeptical. I'm obviously hope not, but I'm skeptical, right? It's still, right. I think there's still a objective value in understanding, truth and history. And this is all now getting muddied on the right.
Yeah. So let's break that down in three parts. I think the first response is if you watch a lot of the America First stuff, yes, you can find the clips of the most outrageous stuff, but there was a pretty good one that came out right after Charlie Kirk's death. And I mean, Fuentes is the strongest advocate of nonviolence amongst them, right? There were plenty of leftists that were celebrating that violence. Um, and the fact is, the right, which again we just get down at the end against structuralism, and it is easy to compare them to Black Lives Matter if you just look at the structure of the organization, and they have some common themes to them. But the thing is, what they objectively believe is a movement. They believe in Catholicism, right? There are rad cats, whatever you want to call them, right? They have this Christian worldview, and that objectively does not allow you to perpetuate that same level of violence. Fundamentally, if there's going to be
But that is not a
you're gonna have
most Jews who understand the history of the Catholic Church and Jews are are not pacified by saying, well, the Catholic Church, right? They're not going to do violence against
the
Jews, right?
Catholic Church. Well, come on. It's not fair to say the modern Catholic Church is the same as the medieval Catholic.
No, sure, yes. In
And I would
1964,
also
I
push
think,
back.
right, they sort of updated, right, their views on Jews. But
Well, okay, I have anyway. We don't need to talk about Vatican II. Vatican II has a whole level of controversy about like certain Catholic rights, whatever. Let's talk specifically about the history of the Catholic Church, and medieval anti-Semitism. Part of that, if you actually look at it structurally, for one, the church never sanctioned violence. What happened was there was a lot of justification by secular states that then used the church as a basis to commit violence. And to the extent the church had, or there were bad bishops, there were bishops that collaborated in the Holocaust, sure. They are not acting in accordance with church teaching. There are people who always act violent in large institutions or usurp the institution's role to further a personal agenda. But if you look at the actual explicit catechismal doctrine, it does not permit violence. It straight up does not. You're not allowed to commit individual violence. And if you do, you are committing mortal sin in the views of the church.
when you go around, and I think this is my same fear about Nick Fuentes, this doesn't have to be a referendum on the medieval church, but just
Sure.
now that you brought that up, when you have people starting from, we can even go as early as, some of, Paul's letters, but right, really starting with, Augustine through the, much of the view of Jews in the church, there's only so much you can say, hey, this one people is responsible for all the ills in the world and rejecting God and rejecting the Messiah and actually killing God and, everything like that, right? Yes, these are ideas, they're not actions, but it's not hard to see the causal effect of then violent mobs actually taking violence up against you.
This is a great point. I actually love talking about this because this brings me up to why the importance of theological discussion, right? Because there were parts in the church. I mean, you could also say the Manichaeans or all the heretics of the old church, right? The Gnostics, right? The same dialogue happened with them. Protestants, right? Protestants and Catholics led to the 100 Years' War, right? Really what this comes down to is balancing particularism with pluralism. Now, the problem we've had in the past 20 years is liberalism is a ideology that really does not tolerate particularism. The problem is if you have no particularism, then you have no identity, right? You're kind of a gray blob. In fact, Judaism cannot exist in a world that is wholly pluralistic and does not tolerate particularistic ideas. And to be fair to you, to both sides, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, even, those ideologies require certain universal truths that might not be compatible. The question has to be, to what extent does the natural law allow us to coexist? That's always been the question, right? It's always been what are our common principles and what are we willing to mutually tolerate and further as a society? I would just say, again, this seems like it's running around the question, but it really is a common theme to it, which is we're just seeing a swing against pluralism. And you're seeing that. You've had your own podcast where you've seen it against in your own community. Kind of a rejection of this idea that you can't have a unique ideology, which religion is a form of ideology, right? It's a form of viewing certain universal truths about the world that are particular to your instantiation of morality. That's what it is, right? I think universities in particular see pluralism as we all have to have kumbaya and, be holding hands and everything. We shouldn't do that. And that actually doesn't make people happy. And I
Well,
think
I mean, I guess I don't know if this is pushing back necessarily or just, trying to figure out exactly what you just meant and seeing if you will agree or disagree. But liberalism or pluralism is, in some sense, the absence of any strong particular beliefs, right? I think you kind of said it before, the sort of gray blob. But I'll take that over most other forums where, I would rather in the public sphere and government and our institutions be run with a pluralistic mentality of we don't really have any, strong particularist beliefs than I would, say going back to the medieval Catholic Church, or of course somebody like a Nick Fuentes type, running government. I mean, that sort of goes without saying. So yes, there is a lot of reason to be critical of liberalism. I think that liberalism.
I don't know if you actually think that, Daniel. Let me give you a hypo real quick. Like,
Please.
would you prefer to live in a society where like AI governs everything, everyone is treated absolutely equally according to some algorithm? We have no particular ideas. Jews are celebrating Christmas. Christians are
No.
celebrating
Sorry, I'm
Hanukkah,
not
like,
saying. I'm talking about the level of who is in charge, not the people
not
that are around. Right. I think the beauty of a liberal democracy is that it allows for many subset groups that have their own particular ideas and particular ways of life without anyone being superimposed on the other. The problem for
well, the
Jews for
problem
most
is
of history is that Jews wanted to retain their particularism, and Jews never really wanted to push their particularism on anyone else because, Jews don't proselytize, and, Judaism's both an
sure.
ethnicity and a religion. And the problem is that for most of history, it was not allowed because the governments that Judaism was under, whether it was, medieval Christendom or medieval Islam, Islam's a little bit more of a gray area. I've done episodes about this before. It depends,
Of course.
when and where. Essentially said, well, no, we have these other set of beliefs that we want to impose on the Jews. And should they not accept it, we're going to make life worse for them, right? Sometimes downright awful, sometimes just
Of
worse than
course.
it would be
And
if
that's obviously evil, right? Because you have an unnatural disordering of how you treat people in society. So what I'm arguing is we're actually upset about that unnatural disordering. We're not upset that there are individual groups in power who have particularistic tendencies. Like I would not have a problem with someone in power who was like explicitly Catholic or explicitly Jewish, as long as they governed society in a way that was just for all groups. But if like for instance, JD Vance said this, right? After the death of Charlie Kirk, he recited the Nicene Creed, right? And that is actually, there is something holy, there's something righteous, there's something good about supporting that particularistic ideology, as long as he's not implying Jews are to be treated less from that. I actually think it creates far less meaning in society. And you've seen this, right? The left is always upset about this, right? Where people kind of seem to say this very empty thoughts and prayers, right? It's because they have no particularistic meaning to the symbol of that. And I actually think it's worse for Judaism. I think it's worse for Catholicism, because people who are in control, right? The law, culture is downstream from the law. In fact, this is very contrary to what the classical conservatives thought. Classical conservatives, because a lot of them had liberal democratic assumptions, thought that culture was downstream, the law was downstream from culture. It's actually quite the opposite. Law forms the culture. It acts as a teacher. And so the problem is when you have a society of liberalism, right? And the law does this. Liberalism acts very subversively against particularistic ideas of the world. You have these civil rights laws, right, that prohibit you in the workplace from basically having any particularistic ideas expressed. And what that creates is a society that believes in nothing. And that's what we're seeing a push against. You're seeing it in every community. Now,
But I essentially do want a government and legal structure that believes in nothing. I believe in something, and you believe in something, and that's great. And the
I'm
fact that
telling you, liberalism doesn't believe in nothing. Liberalism believes it needs to degrade your particularistic ideas. I'm saying in a particularistic law, you are better able
I'm
to
not
be
necessarily
Jewish.
sure. I'm not necessarily sure that that I agree with that. Yes, if you get elected to a position where you're in control of the public sphere in some way, then yes, liberalism tries to temper your views, your personal views, infringing on, your public policy views. But liberalism is not showing up to a synagogue on Saturday and saying, hey, you have a lot of very particularistic language in your, prayer book or, in your song. So can you please talk a little bit more generally? That's something that liberalism protects. And that's something that Jews throughout history that were in non-liberal societies actually had to be a lot more afraid of expressing their particularism because for fear of rapprochement by the government. Again, be it, both under religious and secular governments that were illiberal. And so, Jews have fared much better under liberalism. Again, liberalism is not perfect. I think the problem with liberalism, to throw you a small bone, then I do want to get back to Nick Fuentes because it seems like we've kind of gone off a deep end tangent here. I think liberalism presents a problem of meaning for many individuals within a liberal society because of the sort of pervasive, sentiment that there might be a lack of meaning. In other words, in a liberal society, the onus ends up being on the individual to find meaning in a particularist group, as opposed to a society where it's, bonded together by a religion or a common ethnicity or a common nationality where you already have a lot of those social ties. So yes, I do think that liberalism has its own challenges. I'm not, naive about that. I do want to go back to Tucker Carlson and the Groypers and everything there. Why? I guess I'll ask this in the most general way, and then again we can drill down on specifics. It seems that people like Nick Fuentes, who just from my vantage point, listening to many of the things that he said and many of his jokes and everything like that, I'm shocked that anybody on the right is taking him seriously at all. In other words, he almost just seems like, I don't know, the little kid who, I don't know, there's a substitute teacher and he's just, screaming expletives as loud as he can to get a ruse out of the other kids. But all of a sudden now it seems like there have been reports that, members of Congress are listening to Nick Fuentes and that, and so how did we get to the point in the Republican Party where Nick Fuentes is a relevant voice, not as like, oh, haha, look how stupid this guy is, but as oh, wait, we should really listen to what this guy's saying.
Well, because he's channeling the exact frustrations of that audience that I brought up at the beginning. And none of the other commentators do a good job at exactly doing this, right? And the fact it is expletives, right? Well, that's what they're feeling. And the fact is, so I'm going to point this out too. If you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, it doesn't matter. And by the way, this is not even a partisan viewpoint. Gavin Newsom has actually done podcasts on this, right? On understanding these frustrations, because he also understands it's the majority of the group. These institutions run on a political vanguard that is able to walk precincts, organize, and get voters out. Anyone who's done politics understands this. If you don't have a good walking campaign or you don't have billions of dollars to fund walkers, which, by the way, actually a lot of political science data that shows those are very inefficient walkers compared to your true believers, the vanguard, you're not going to win elections. And in a democracy, that's how you retain power. And so the fact of the matter is, if you have a subgroup of college Republicans, walkers, people who've worked on these campaigns, and they're not going to work. They're not going to die for your movement anymore because you haven't fulfilled your promises to them. The economy's worse. Their economic reality's worse. Their social reality's worse. You're going to start asking yourselves, why is that the case? And so I think this has...
But this just seems like, again, there's a direct line here between... One can make the same argument about Germany in the interwar period about there being terrible economic prospects and Jews being scapegoated. Like, I still don't understand how this isn't an obvious 5-alarm fire for anybody who's paying attention. And again, granted, yes, there has not yet been a large violent uprising from Nick Fuentes followers against Jews, but there wasn't much, anti-Semitism breaking out in the streets in Germany in 1920, right? It fomented. And so this is exactly why I'm shocked that, again, there's always going to be people like Nick Fuentes. Yes, any 8th grade class, there's the guy who does the Hail Hitler because he's trying to be, funny and whatever and get laughs out of his friends. And Nick Fuentes, I kind of see as that guy. What I'm more shocked at is the fact that sort of the quote unquote, grown-ups, I don't know if the Republican Party still has, real grown-ups, but they're not, they aren't, no, I mean, listen, I was talking to Congressman Don Bacon on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he's willing to condemn in the strongest of terms this entire wing of the Republican Party, from Steve Bannon rightwards, right? What he calls the populist wing. But that seems like a minority. I mean, why are people like JD Vance and Trump not willing to say, this is obviously stupid and ridiculous and dangerous and anti-Semitic? I mean, it just seems
Because
like it would
they,
be.
because they, yeah, great question. So for one, like it's because Don Bacon's views are outdated. He doesn't understand the frustrations of his constituency.
But I
Uh,
understand. But 1 second. But pause.
yeah.
You can be frustrated. That doesn't mean it's the Jews' fault, right? Like
Okay.
if
Yeah.
you
Let's just address the
if
elephant.
you accidentally, get into a car crash on your drive home from the office, that will suck. I will feel really bad for you. I'll try to make sure you're okay. You'll have to get, rehab. It'll be, but it's not, and it's totally reasonable if, you know, you start to say, woe is me, and oh my God, this is so terrible, whatever. It's not reasonable if you say, it's the Jewish conspiracy that tried to get me in a car crash, right? So, like, I totally get the
Yeah,
reason
I get
why.
the Candace Owens stuff. Yeah.
No,
Again,
but not even Candace Owens. It's all of it. I mean, it's Tucker Carlson. Nick Fuentes has also dabbled in this, and so I totally understand what you're saying in terms of the socioeconomic prospects. Again, we might be able to, we can debate a little bit about just how bad it is. I'm not ready to go full nihilistic. I don't think anybody listening to this podcast should either. I think that is largely also a social media echo chamber of, woe is us, the world is collapsing, right? So, if I
sure.
do meet a
Yeah.
19-year-old that thinks that they have no romantic or economic prospects, I would tell them, hey, one, you can learn anything you want on the internet now, basically for free, and you can start doing push-ups, and you can go to the gym, you can eat a little bit healthier, you can train yourself to talk to girls, right? Like it's not that
Train
hard. It's
yourself.
not rocket
Yeah, but
science.
liberalism tries to
But
deter all of that.
but on the other, I don't know. I don't think liberalism tries to deter push-ups. But on the other hand, right, it's totally unreasonable when you start to say, it must be this shady conspiracy of Jews that are really the right. Like that's the part I'm not getting. So granted, I understand your same, the underlying socioeconomic concerns. I understand. It's the next step, which
Yeah,
has
so
been the
so can I
dangerous
clarify your
step in
question?
human
You're
history of
asking
saying,
why does this frustration manifest as anti-Semitism?
I even understand that, right? Because even going back to, I don't know, the Khmelnytsky massacres, right? Obviously the Holocaust, obviously many of the Eastern European pogroms, right? Like things get blamed on Jews when shit hits the fan in mostly Christian societies, right? So that is just a historic staple. But I guess I'm asking you as sort of a you know, not representative, but somebody who deeply understands the Republican mentality and insiders. And I'm sure you're talking to people that are in both California government and federal government and the Republican side. What is going through the leaders' minds who they obviously know better because the last, 20 or 30 years that most of these people have been around in the Republican Party, they have pushed back against anti-Semitism. And all of a sudden, I mean, is it just that they don't want to lose out on the constituency of young
No,
Nick
it's not
Fuentes
really.
followers?
I always push against this in undergrad particularly, just because of the way we're trained, we want to look at everything as self-interest. So the kind of the constituency part is partially driven by self-interest, but you could also view your constituency in a moral light, right? Which is you are trying to represent their frustrations because you were democratically elected to office. Now, I will explain it this way. For one, I don't think the America First movement is fundamentally anti-Semitic. And what do I mean by that? Well, for one, I don't think they hate Jews dogmatically. I think it's just a catchy way to, get online traction. But secondly, if you actually listen to their policy claims, this is very much unlike the Nazi Party, right? The Nazi Party in Germany was very explicit with its plans, right? Hitler was not hiding what his plans were. Maybe some of the extent of his plans, but like it was very explicit. I mean, it wasn't just about the Holocaust, right? It was about invading Russia, invading most of Europe, war plans. Like no one in the America First movement is making those same advocacies. So, I mean, they're really not comparable. Really, what they want is they just want a society back where they can own a house, have a wife, live a traditional life, make a good income, and it so happens that it manifests as these pointing out these inconsistencies. One of the inconsistencies, by the way, is with foreign aid. That's kind of where a lot of this gets
No,
wrapped,
but
right? It
listen,
gets
I
wrapped up.
understand, but this is apples to oranges. I mean, one, I'll point out, you said that they don't dislike Jews dogmatically. Most, right, the Nazis were almost sort of a, unique category of anti-Semites that had some essentialized hatred of Jews, right? Most anti-Semites throughout history, whether religious or secular, just hated where the majority of Jews were at, right? So if you're in a very communist society, well, you don't hate Jews, you just hate the globalists, right? And if you're in a very communist society, well, you don't hate Jews, you just hate the bankers. It happened to mostly. So I sort of, I think I reject that
The
premise,
correlation. Okay.
um, but, but yeah, I mean, I think everybody in America wants to get to a place where young people can get a house, right? And yes, I even understand, and I think I discussed this. We did a podcast about half a year ago, and I'm willing to grant some moral legitimacy to the argument that why is the U.S. giving Israel foreign aid when we have, all these poor people here? I don't agree with it for political reasons, right? I think it's sort of shallow and short-sighted. I think the benefits to America in our partnership with Israel outgrow, the opportunity cost. But again, that is a policy debate that I'm willing to have, and I don't think it's immoral or unreasonable if you say, no, what are you talking about? That is different than Nick Fuentes making jokes about the fact that it couldn't have possibly been 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust because it would take a really long time to bake 6 million cookies, right? Which is, one of his jokes. And so
Sure.
that's the apples to oranges. Like I do not see a logical line of, well, it seems like we're giving a lot of foreign aid when, I don't know, veterans can't pay for, health care, all the way to things like that. That is the massive gap. And it seems like a lot of people on the alt-right, I don't know if they call themselves the alt-right anymore, the populist, whatever it is, they almost see it as like a natural continuity. They're like, well, of course, we're against giving aid to Israel, so therefore the Holocaust must be a sham, and maybe Hitler wasn't so bad after all. So, like, explain that to me. How is,
No one on the right is making that link. I was on Steve Bannon's show. He's very reasonable in this policy perspective, very Trump-esque. These people are not making that argument. I think this is generally a straw man of their argument. And, I want to say I understand your concerns with that seems to be where it's leading. Again, I think what we need, and by the way, Steve Bannon talks about this, is that the algorithms and AI have incentivized this sort of dialogue because it makes you money, it gets you clicks. And people are going to lean towards whatever is most extreme in society, or most edgy, right? It's the new edgy thing to be this. And I think that's unfortunate. We should deter that behavior and we should have an ordered behavior. And this is actually why I advocate at the beginning these more particularistic beliefs, because if you had people who were strong Catholics, they couldn't believe that. If you had these people who were, which by the way, I'm not discounting that Nick isn't Catholic. I couldn't deny somebody who's baptized from being Catholic. I'm just saying anti-Semitism is not Catholic. It is explicitly against what Vatican II said. And by the way, I mean, there are tons of counterexamples to this. I'll give you an example. Daily Wire just acquired Pints with Aquinas, right? There are tons of great Catholic news sources out there that, are not the quote unquote edgy anti-Semitic types. It just so happens that the edgy anti-Semitic types type to get, they get popular on Twitter and social media websites. To also defend the Groypers for a moment, yeah, okay, there's some bots out there. Yeah, okay, there's some schizo extremists out there. Which, by the way, I found this funny. If you actually listen to some of the America First podcast, they start getting called out, right? Because they're just so insane. I mean, the Candace Owens types. And it actually delegitimizes their movement for the extent they are trying to legitimize it, to make all these random anti-Semitic claims. It's like, no, dude, some of it is your fault. If you're just going to be a fat neat at home and not doing anything to better yourself, no, you actually deserve that. And it's actually worse for you to.
But even from a religious perspective,
yeah,
right? Put me in the mind of if you are a Catholic youth pastor, right? Or what's happening at the churches or at the Catholic summer camps or anything like that. And kids are starting to, watch and be influenced by people like Nick Fuentes and their ilk, and again, have this sort of nihilistic mentality of, I mean, what are the conversations, going on? Is this a generational thing? Is this, do you think there's any top-down nature for any of the religious clergy? I mean,
not.
So what exactly is happening? Because it does seem like it's a trend of young Catholic men, right? And if I'm wrong about that, let me know. But just from, reading about this, in terms of like who's following Nick Fuentes. And so obviously the Catholic community is divided on it, right? You are a young Catholic man. I don't think that you're a fan of Nick Fuentes. Right. So you're obviously on one side of the debate, but what are those conversations that are happening like in churches and youth groups?
So I'm going to say this because of course, very transparent. There's actually a great article I did, probably right as I was getting out of undergrad. It was funny because the journalist contacted me and said, "I don't want to ruin your life with this." And I'm like, "Dude, my views are very explicit, have been pretty explicit for the past 10 years." Where I made a reference to that article. I'll send it to you. It's actually a College Report article where it says the far right march on campus, right? And it cites me saying explicitly this, that
Kimo, I was quoted in that article.
yes. Oh, yes, you were. Good. Yes.
And I was quoted in that article saying
Actually, I think we had the same debate in that article.
I was quoted in the article saying the exact same thing I'm saying now. And yeah, we
Yep.
had, so yes, people can find that. Maybe I'll throw it in the
Yeah,
show
throw it
notes.
in the link. I think that's a fun one. Again, it's very interesting that he falsely equivocates my views. Um, again, there is some extra commentary to that article, clearly, but I think the article wasn't that bad at strawmanning my views. I have a view that society should be naturally ordered. I'd push back on him with, well, do you believe in a society that's not naturally ordered? Like, even liberalism makes arguments about natural law. You can't have the Nuremberg trials without natural law, right? This is actually an internal argument to the right about positivism. Scalia infamously said he didn't think there was grounds for the Nuremberg trials, which is patently ridiculous. The opposite side of this, I would say, in regards to all of this, no, the clergy does not. In fact, I see people far more fulfilled when they are going to church consistently. The first thing they listen to is their pastors, and they listen to the messages of the Bible. And by the way, the churches are doing a much better job at creating relationships. A lot of the churches I go to, they will have dating events. They will get young couples together. That is very healthy for society. And so I think our particularistic institutions are going to begin to fill that gap that Twitter, is filling, when you're a NEET at home and you're not doing anything and you're unhealthy, right? This is a big dialogue in the conservative movement, which the difference between the conservative movement and the leftists is I know for a fact based on the trends, we believe in an ordered society, which means we will move towards ordered behaviors and self-correct. The left will increasingly become more sinful and viceful, and their behaviors will become increasingly disordered. Really, at the end of the day, it is.
Listen, I understand
Yeah.
the wider religious rights perspective on all these things. Whether or not I agree is a separate story. I'm still not right. I guess all you've offered in terms of the disconnect of a lot of people, like let's say JD Vance.
Give me a short version of the question just to make sure I'm answering it. I feel like I'm talking around you, so because I'm hitting on some of the premises of the question.
Here's the short version. Somebody like JD Vance, who there's been a lot of speculation about his refusal to condemn people like Fuentes and actual explicit defense at times of people like Tucker Carlson, there's only a couple options. If he thinks that's ridiculous, he should just come out and say, this is ridiculous. Of course, I condemn what they're saying. The fact that he isn't, right? Is he afraid of the backlash? Is this actually what he believes, right? Is it somewhere in the middle there where he thinks it should be accepted into the Overton window of Republican politics of, you have your Ben Shapiro, and Marco Rubio types, and then you have your 6 million seems like a large number. And, could that have possibly happened types? And, we have a very diverse movement because we have both of these. And so somebody like a JD Vance, why is he not able and willing to just come out and say, yes, you're right. This has gone off the deep end. This is not, true Republican politics or true conservative politics. Because anything short of that, I mean, again, there is, a concern. And,
No, I disagree with this premise. JD Vance has condemned it. He just doesn't spend all of his time condemning it. And the fact is, he's a political genius in terms of knowing how to stay focused. If we spend all our time condemning ourselves, we're going to lose every election. That is the reality. And he has, by the way. I literally just pulled up a Twitter comment where somebody makes, Groyper makes a comment about his wife, right? This is a whole nother thing with immigration. He says, what a disgusting comment. And it's hardly been the only one along these lines. Um, and he goes into it explicitly. He has explicitly condemned it. The fact is, it's not a big issue. The real issues facing the American people, as I've explained, they are housing, they are economic realities of getting jobs, immigration. Like, he's just a focused politician. So my response to that's pretty simple. It's the party wants to stay focused. It's not a big deal because it isn't. And if we
But I
solve,
don't understand how this is staying focused. You have some of the biggest spokespeople of the right, some in Congress and some outside of Congress. Again, people like, the Daily Wire and Ben Shapiro, this is explicitly tearing that in half right now. And so
it's not tearing the Daily Wire apart. I mean, come on,
no,
Ben
no, no.
Shapiro.
I'm not saying the Daily Wire is being torn in half. I'm saying, the Republican movement, or MAGA, is being torn in half right now between.
That's a leftist conspiracy. They're not. That is the frank answer.
But no, but one second. You have, I mean, again, just because I've been very interested in
Sure.
this debate, I've, started listening to a lot of Ben Shapiro podcasts in the last 2 or 3 weeks to see how
Right.
he's addressing all this. And he is
And he
spending,
addressed it once.
he's probably spending 50% of his time talking about how terrible this is, as he should be, because this is sort of crazy and alarming and everything. And so, he, I think, still has one of the biggest platforms on the right. And so it is taking up a ton of airtime, and there's more and more people talking about it right now. And in the 2028, Republican primary, I'm sure this is going to be brought up, and I'm sure there's going to be someone from the, more traditional conservative faction and someone from the populist faction. And, so this is sort of the future of the forking paths within the Republican Party.
No, 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 no. Okay, so I'm gonna fact check you real quick here. I hate when people do this, but fact check. Look, I'm on his channel right now. There are 3 videos about this particularly, and that's taken liberally. Like, if you take his video, my words are being taken out of context. To be fair, I know those are split ups. I have a Daily Wire subscription, so I listen to this occasionally. And yeah, that's just not a fair representation. Like, all of his videos are usually about radical Islam.
No, of course he's talking about that also, but you know what? Just yesterday, he was on this big panel for Jewish conservatives, talked about it. The Republican Jewish Coalition, I believe last week, spent a ton of their conference talking about this, right? So this is taking up a lot of airtime on that. Again, I'm not saying that this is, all that the right
So, to
wing is
also be
talking
fair,
about.
that's a little bit of a survivorship bias. Obviously, the Jewish Republican coalition is going to be overtly concerned with that. The Daily Wire is not a like Jewish podcast per se, right? Ben Shapiro obviously brings us perspectives incidentally. Um, I mean, and yeah, it is true. Look, it's linked up, it's pinned on his Twitter, right? He says no to Groypers, no to cowards like Tucker Carlson, which I disagree, he's a coward. Really, he's the opposite to some extent. Um, I'll be charitable for a moment. I understand the underlying concern. The way to resolve that is to stay focused, like JD Vance does, address the underlying issues, and those problems will go away. That is very much unlike the just repress the Groyper movement, repress what they're talking about. That's going to do the opposite. And by the way, that is what I predicted in that college article back in the day, which I said, if there are not changes made in the GOP, this is what's going to happen. That was descriptively true, and I think that's manifested. The GOP is a very easy path here to resolve these. Resolve the issues related to marriage. Resolve the issues related to housing. Resolve the issues related to jobs. You will get rid of the anti-Semitism along with that.
But this is sort of a crazy thing to suggest as a from any which way perspective, because these are things that are probably right. There's always going to be in every society, no matter how left wing or right wing, some people who lose out, right? There's always going to be somebody who feels like they
Yeah,
should
but
have got
not 70% of society. And look here, this is where the free marketers like me are partially wrong, which cards on the table, obviously I benefit from the free market, but look, when 70% of the population is not going to have jobs, and that's going to increase as AI is integrated, you have to provide a remedy for them. You have to provide.
I agree. Listen, but we're not talking about socialism or UBI or free market right now. We're talking about
I mean, a lot of
how
the Groyper stuff does talk about that.
no, but you're right. But I'm saying what I'm saying is the fact that anti-Semitism seems like an emergent principle for all this, right? That right, you can't listen to somebody like Nick Fuentes and be like, well, his concerns are coming from something that I'm also concerned about, so let's take him seriously. Again, if
Yeah.
you know
Okay.
there
I
there
understand what you're saying now. You're
there are
saying why
plenty of
platform Nick Fuentes? Actually, I think I asked you this in the last podcast.
there are plenty of things that concern me, and I'm sure that I share those concerns with people who think that there are very different ends to it, right?
Sure.
So again, this is, you know, what you're doing, I think, is just you're sort of mixing up the premise and the question. Like, yes, I think everybody would agree we're at a crossroads right now in American socioeconomic history of uncertainty and AI and, income inequality and everything. And it seems like everybody, except for, some people who aren't, maybe are 80 and not paying attention, everybody's thinking about this, right? It's probably why Mamdani won in New York, right? It's
Yeah.
why, so yes, right? It's why Trump probably won out in 2016, right, in the Republican primary, because he was specifically saying he's going to, be anti-institutional as opposed to, just be another institutional puppet. So I totally get that. But again, saying all of that as sort of, well, if we only fix all of this, which is, probably the number one challenge our society has moving forward, then anti Semitism will fall away. And until then, let's keep these guys around because at least they're pointing out, the
I
frustration that a
see.
lot of people feel, right? That's sort of just a shallow argument. It's like, well, I'm really up.
I'm not saying like
I'm
we should push them in the institutions. I'm saying it's never worked to censor them.
No, but I'm really upset that cancer exists. I would like cancer to go away. But if I decided that if only we enslave all women in our society, that cancer would go away, and I start to make this my huge platform and get a following, other people shouldn't be like, well, he is right about cancer being really bad. So perhaps we should give him light of day, right? I would correctfully be, you know, outside the Overton window. And people like Nick Fuentes, right? The argument that you're giving, I understand sociologically, but it's not a moral defense, right? It's just as crazy as my female slave
I see.
example.
Do you want me to make a moral defense, the charitable
No,
moral
no, no.
defense for Groyper?
I'm a
I'll make
charitable
one.
defense. I'm asking.
Yeah.
I'm asking why you think that the Republican world has not understood the simple moral equation that I just laid out there.
I think it does. I think it just thinks the remedy to it is to resolve the socioeconomic problems, and then it would fix it. Nick Fuentes is not going to be made Secretary of Transportation or HHS, right? You know, I don't think Nick Fuentes is related to the policy solution. Like, no one in the GOP is like, yeah, if we just got rid of those Jews from Hollywood, we would resolve everything. I don't think anyone is making that argument. I don't think
No,
anyone has institutional power. Like, I think it is pretty crazy to argue Trump is. The reason Trump said what he did is it's a nod towards people listening to the substantive underlying issues. It really, if you want to point out a divorce here, it is a divorce from the libertarian movement in the Republican Party. That's the one I see.
but I don't understand. Can't Trump do a better job if Trump really wants to give, a nod and a wink to, again, our 19-year-old college student who was convinced to go into computer programming and now doesn't have a job because AI's taken over, which, a very real, situation that a lot of students are in. Why doesn't he just say that as opposed to
I
a
mean, he has.
nod to somebody who's
It just
made no,
doesn't get traction.
so you're saying you need the sort of in your face Holocaust denialism for the
Oh,
algorithm to pick you up to give you
no.
traction to then
I'm
shine light
saying
on your cause.
that's why I'm saying he has made those. They don't get algorithm traction. And so the only reason we're talking about it here is because the clicks go towards the most extreme stuff. He has said that many times.
Sure, but then why? Again, I guess I'll ask this one more time, and then we can,
Yeah.
either move on or wrap it up because I think we might have hit a wall here. Why does that come with the refusal to outrightly condemn?
But he has outrightly condemned.
he hasn't. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, both JD Vance and Trump have been asked to weigh in on, the Tucker Carlson Nick
He's
Fuentes
not done it
interview.
over again 500 times.
But it's not a
Look,
question of 500 times. It's a question of, yes, maybe once 2.5 years ago, Trump might have had some tweet about it or whatever. But
to be
again, things
specific,
things
I'll
are.
answer the JD Vance the JD Vance Tucker Carlson thing, right? They have a legitimate perspective. And by the way, this was the perspective we talked about last time I was on, which was, is it okay to have an interview with Nick Fuentes? And the answer is yes, he should not be censored. Now, we disagree with it substantively, and we bring that dialogue into the public marketplace, but that does not mean that we should censor him. And so people are asking, should we censor Nick Fuentes? Should we ban him off platforms? The answer is no. That always empowers people to censor and ban them. And so we have to have a marketplace of ideas here.
I think I agree with you that censoring is bad. Marketplace of ideas, yes. I think in the actual marketplace of ideas, hopefully ideas like his would lose out. But I think part of that is having elected leaders that we trust their wisdom to actually weigh in on these ideas, to overinflate good ideas and deflate bad ideas.
And
And
they have addressed the, like, I don't know how much more Trump can do to show he's pro-Zionist, to say he's like, he literally could not do much more in terms of actual policy and his explicit statements. Same with JD Vance, right? They've done more than any president has for Israel, for tackling anti-Semitism. And look, at the end of the day, it's just not going to be 100% of the folks of the administration, nor should it. The administration has to focus on the issues of all the American people. And the wisdom of the American of our leaders is to pursue alternative policy platforms, which include housing reform, economic reform, everything I've listed. So look, at the end of the day, my answer is it's just not prudent. They have condemned it. They're not going to focus on it, and they're not going to give in to the left's bias on the algorithms to hyperinflate this issue. They will lose
I would,
elections if they do that.
I listen. I would push back on the idea of the left's, overinflation of this issue. I think they're going to lose election on the other side if they're not willing to speak out clearly about this in terms of, because all I would do if I'm Democrat or a centrist is just play loops of these people, and then other loops of people like JD Vance saying, listen, Tucker's a good guy or whatever, refusing to condemn him. So
I mean,
that seems like.
I wouldn't condemn, like, I'll put this out there. I would not condemn Tucker Carlson, right? I don't agree with him, but what good does it do to go out in society and just dehumanize people and say they're evil and everything? You attack their
No,
ideas.
it's not a question. I mean, condemning somebody is not saying that they are evil and beyond,
But a
any.
lot of the traditional cancellation culture did do that. It attempted to destroy their lives personally. And that did happen to Nick Fuentes.
Again, that's a separate argument. You can speak out strongly against somebody doing something, and that is different than making an essentialized statement about the evilness or lack thereof of their being. I think that's a pretty obvious differentiation.
Agree.
Republicans don't seem to have any problem condemning things that they view to be morally problematic, right? I think we are on the same page about that, right? Like, that gay marriage will probably never be overturned in America, right? The Supreme Court
I
didn't
don't
even want to.
agree.
Okay, whatever. We can, come back to that. But right, but you still, make it a point to speak out against it, even if it's probably not very prudent, right? I don't think it's going to help Republicans win elections if they run on a anti-gay marriage platform. But I'm imagining somebody like you would say, well, we actually have values also, but just wanting to get elected, and so those values cause me to speak out against gay marriage, right? Again, I disagree with you on that one, but we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. I understand your view, and you have values, right? And so, right, why are those same values not going towards, hey, it's unreasonable for Tucker Carlson to host a Holocaust denier on his podcast and say he's the most important historian that we have, right? Like, what is the point of that other than it going viral and getting a lot of clicks and everything like that, right? I mean, again, we can even make this not about Jews, right? Tucker's trip to Russia when he was going through the supermarket, right? Like, why is your.
Yeah, and look, yeah, let's make this not about Jews for a moment. I mean, he also interviewed the Ayatollah, right? And I think all of that is
No, but
good.
again, there's a difference between doing an interview as like a hard-hitting journalist of, we're going to ask you tough questions, right? That's good. What I think shocked a lot of people with Tucker Carlson, and just to explain this for listeners who might not be as perennially online as we are, although if they're still listening after an hour, they're probably interested in this and probably have somewhat of a background. Is a couple months ago, he interviews Ted Cruz, who's obviously a Republican, very pro-Israel member of Congress, and he grills him. Again, maybe good, maybe bad that he grilled him, right? You know, journalists should grill people in power, right? That's why we have a free press. And then he gets Nick Fuentes and just doesn't push back on anything, right? Nick Fuentes is giving crazy conspiracy theories. People can go watch. I mean, I watched the entire thing. And Tucker Carlson is not pushing back. He's just, letting him speak.
Yeah, I thought
And
the Stalin one was the funniest. That was yeah, obviously. So yeah, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying, right? Obviously, but like, what do you expect? You want the Republican Party to come out and say we're opposed to Stalin? Like, no, duh. Obviously, that's true. These things are out there. It's just not prudent in the current media environment to go out there and post anti-Stalin statements, right? And I'm going to say this too. I thought the interview with Ted Cruz, it was hard hitting. But obviously, there's a distinction because you're just not going to get an interview with the Russian president or the Ayatollah if you're going to ask the super hard questions, right? Then that's not going to lead to anything. We just want to see their view charitably. Now, I wish we had a charitable view of Ted Cruz. I think we all know the charitable view of Ted Cruz. So he's a senator in the United States. His interview is going to be different than the Ayatollah. And, I oppose, obviously, those draconian authoritarian regimes that hurt and murder people. But also, it would be way worse if we didn't hear their viewpoint. And so, look, I totally understand the concerns. And we do make our moral statements clear, but we're also practical. We're not, this is the problem with the left. The left loves to virtue signal at every point and never get anything done. The goal of the right has to be to manage courage and balance it with prudence. And so the point I make is we need to govern for what benefits the American people, and that's keeping them focused. And the internet is dangerous because it unhinges us from that goal. If we spend all the time condemning people on the right, we're never going to solve dangerous things that are actually happening right now. The systematic murder of children, the theft of property by the left, especially some, the new mayor of New York City, God bless him, but some of his advocacies have basically amounted to a takings, and I'm sure there will be a constitutional case against him on takings if he ever tries to implement any of those solutions. And that's what is dangerous. That is what is immediately facing us. We should definitely condemn anti-Semitism in the strongest of terms. We should condemn it, and we should move on. Because if we spend all our time on it, we're not going to solve things.
I mean, I think I agree with you to some extent. I think the refusal to condemn it is the reason why it's taking so much airtime, right? So I think, if, let's just take this podcast as an example. If JD Vance and Trump last week had come out and condemned it, I would not have wanted to have this conversation with you. So I do think it cuts both ways. We've been talking for a while. We don't have to,
Sure.
go down the rabbit hole. Is there anything else that we didn't
I think this is a
address?
great, yeah. So I think this is a great conversation. Thank you for having me on, Daniel. I don't see anything more directly related to this issue. I just want to point out, go read, and I encourage viewers to see this. The reason the dialogue of Hitler and the Nazis, has become so clickbaity has a deep history to it. It didn't come out of nowhere. Fuentes did not invent it. The left has been calling the right Hitler and the Nazis for uh, decades. And so the problem is that sort of dialogue, it means nothing to anyone on the right anymore. Because they've been called that forever on college campuses. Ben Shapiro is being called a Nazi constantly, right? And so when you normalize that sort of dialogue, expect that it means nothing. And so the left has really brought this upon themselves.
I agree that the left, and this will be the last thing I say. The left has certainly messed up with reducing things they don't like to Hitler. Yes, that doesn't mean you then go become Hitler to troll them, right? And I think that is important on both sides. The left should not call anybody with slightly more conservative views Hitler, and the right should not say, well, they've anyway been calling us Hitler. We might as well start doing more Hitler things. Thank you for the conversation. And I'm sure
Thank you, Rabbi.
I'll continue to, give you calls and pick your brain whenever I see things like this.
Yeah, and for viewers, go read that article. I think it's pretty insightful. And honestly, Daniel and I, this debate was a little prophetic.
Yeah, I will throw it in the YouTube podcast notes here.
Yep. Thank you.